Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. My name is Alan Abbey, and I'm the media director here at the Institute. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome everyone here in our Beit Midrash, and those of you watching online to a special live webcast of the opening lecture of our 2016 summer programs. More than 400 community leaders, rabbis, scholars, students, and others from 9 countries and 31 U.S. states and Canadian provinces will be here at the Institute this summer. The theme for the studies is What is a Jew? Dilemmas of Identity in the 21st Century. For those of you not here, many of the lectures in the next week or two will be filmed and posted on our website and YouTube channel in coming days. We open our program tonight with Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer. Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer is president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Yehuda is a leading thinker and author on the meaning of Israel to American Jews, the value of the Jewish past to the Jewish present, and questions of leadership and change in American Jewish life. Yehuda Kurtzer's topic tonight is American Jewish Identity and Counterculture. Thank you very much, and now without any further ado, Dr. Yehuda Kurtzer.
So hi, everybody. First of all, to those who are here, welcome to Jerusalem. This place feels so dramatically different upon your arrival, and your coming here marks the real transition for this institution into HartmanSummer. You're the first of many programs over the course of the next 6 weeks of American Jewish, Muslim, and Christian leaders who will be here in Jerusalem engaging with the questions of the day. And I know that this was said earlier, but on behalf of all of the staff and the faculty here, we've been waiting for you and we're really excited. And I'll say to the folks who are online, we're happy to have you here too, virtually, and as our people are wont to say, next summer in Jerusalem. The topic tonight is actually, what is an American Jew? And this question means to kick off our week on the question of what is a Jew, dilemmas of identity in the 21st century. And I want to start with some of the problems, and in particular, the challenge or multiple challenges that we're going to face in talking about identity over the course of this week. Problem number one is that the identity of both American Jews and Israeli Jews is undergoing unbelievably rapid change at a pace in which it's not clear that the very categories that we use for talking about identity can actually keep up, much less any previous definitions or assumptions of what it means to be a Jew. We'll talk more in this session and others about what has changed in American Jewish life, what has changed in the state of Israel, and it does sometimes feel, as I'll try to unpack over the course of tonight's presentation, it does sometimes feel that even the questions that we ask about identity presuppose categories that no longer speak to who American Jews actually are. Second of all, and this is a really tricky one, it's oftentimes very difficult to talk about identity in general without getting into the business of policing boundaries or operating from a sense of crisis. Identity almost always, the minute I describe somebody's identity, it oftentimes feels as though I'm engaging in the work of creating and policing boundaries. And so sometimes trying to define somebody's identity is a legitimate act that inevitably leads to policing boundaries, but more often than not, it's the implicit desire to create boundaries between self and other that prompts the identity conversation to begin with. The older conversation, see the big shift of this class, is that it used to be that the conversation was who is a Jew, and now what you see, it's a big move, we changed to what is a Jew. But there's a meaningful difference between who is a Jew and what is a Jew. The older Jewish conversation that dominated Jewish life in a previous generation, the question of who is a Jew, took in essence for granted that we knew what a Jew was in the world, or it wasn't particularly the answer that we wanted to get to. What we wanted to figure out was where do the boundaries of the Jewish people begin and end. And therefore, the who is a Jew discourse was almost always a legal discourse, and it's not surprising that it operated primarily within the framework of belonging and citizenship here in the state of Israel. The question instead that we want to talk about is one, can we talk about Jewish identity without necessarily speaking defensively and protectively and not necessarily translating the questions of Jewish identity into public policy? As a corollary to that, American Jewish identity, or the conversation about American Jewish identity, is often a conversation predicated on an assumption that the American Jewish community is collapsing. Right? So we are talking not just about what is so interesting and transformational about what it has meant to become a Jew in America. We're talking about some implicit assumption that Jewish identity used to be better. Once upon a time, we knew who we were, and therefore we knew how to act, and the bottom has fallen out. And so the conversation about identity is not merely one of policing boundaries, but it's a conversation oftentimes that's fundamentally about nostalgia. Jewish identity in those contexts is imagined as something that a person is trying to hold on to in circumstances where that identity is fundamentally no longer viable. So oftentimes Jewish identity conversations take for granted that Jewish identity is virtually impossible. It's like a supernatural phenomenon that someone would still have a Jewish identity. And as a result, there are more and more scholars in the American Jewish community who are skeptical about the underlying motivations about what it means to be talking about Jewish identity to begin with. Find me somebody talking about Jewish identity, and then I can try to discern what are their political, legal, nostalgic, or other motivations to start this Jewish identity conversation to begin with. So those are the challenges that I think we face. And what we want to try to do over this week is to have a conversation about identity that acknowledges the obstacles that we're living through to Jewish identity, to maintaining and sustaining a meaningful Jewish identity, but doesn't make identity exclusively a response to those obstacles and problems. Right? There's a big difference there. Acknowledging the obstacles, but not making identity entirely a reactive discourse to the obstacles that are out there. We want to try to imagine answers, and I'll try to provide some text today, and of course our faculty will do more over the course of this week. We'll try to imagine the answers to the question of what does it mean to be a Jew without automatically translating those answers into legal, policy, and other positions that wind up policing the discourse. Can we describe something without automatically asking what happens if it fails? And I want to especially try, tonight we'll hear from a few of my colleagues from North America as well on this front. I really want to try to have a conversation about Jewish identity that tries to think in positive terms about what a Jewish identity can mean in the world without defaulting to the best historical shortcut that the Jewish people have ever had in terms of creating and sustaining a strong Jewish identity, which is essentially being hated by other people. Right? Anti-Semitism is by far the best shortcut to a Jewish identity. As long as they know that you are different, you can re-internalize your difference. I want to acknowledge that doesn't mean that there is, especially in today's conversation, it doesn't mean that there isn't anti-Semitism in America, and that anti-Semitism in America is manifesting sometimes in old forms and sometimes in new forms. It's a conversation that's worth having, and it might translate to all sorts of Jewish public policies that could be developed to how we combat such anti-Semitism. But I do want to make sure that when we have a conversation about Jewish identity, it's operating in a different framework and not simply on the assumption that Jews were Jews, will be Jews, and always will remain Jews simply because others are making that case. It simply doesn't comport, that narrative just doesn't comport with the realities that most American Jews live in, and it falls short of what we try to do here at the Institute, which is to have a conversation about Jewish identity that can be descriptive, inviting, and constructive. Right? Again, we can talk about where anti-Semitism is and why it matters, but if we can't re-articulate for ourselves what it means to be a Jew, with a positive identity, live in a world in which the identity to be a Jew is a choice that one might make in a marketplace, we're hoping for the worst possible shortcut. And there is this kind of weird, perverse phenomenon of longing for an anti-Semitism that will remind us of what it means to be a Jew. We American Jews are living through one or possibly three or more revolutions. And I say we American Jews because I think most of the folks in the room are American, even though we find ourselves in Jerusalem. American Jews are living through a revolution that we tend to treat as an evolution. And this is creating really interesting challenges for our institutions, for our communities, for our schools, when we respond to massive historical trends as though they reflect incremental differences from one generation to the next. And there's all sorts of reasons why I think we treat these massive changes as evolution rather than revolution. One significant reason is that the 20th century inclined us to believe that massive transformational events that force a different self-understanding of who we are in the world are major geopolitical events, like the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel. And as a result, even though to be a Jew in America in 2016 is dramatically different than it meant to be a Jew in America in 1976, we're still thinking about these as evolutionary changes rather than revolutionary changes. I see it operating on at least three different fronts. One, on the nature of ethnicity, which in some ways we'll call identity in this session today. Radically different changes in the nature of Jewish institutions in America, which we could also call belonging, what it means to belong to institutions, be members of them, to assume that an American Jewish community has to have an institutional landscape as reflective of who Jews are. And radical different changes in American Jewish life when it comes to our politics, which we might call our ideas and our ethics. In this framing, if we actually are living through a massive transformation of what it means to be a Jew in America in the early 21st century, phenomena like intermarriage, which is going to be one of those topics that's hovering beneath the surface whenever you talk about identity, but this week as well, phenomena like intermarriage are indicators more than causes of the change in American Jewish identity. The prevailing causes of these changes in Jewish identity are a massive set of cultural, social, political factors, and an environment in which Jewish identity can no longer be taken for granted or assumed, but actually constitutes an ongoing, unfolding set of choices that individuals make in environments in which choice is required, that then translate into sub-choices or other affirmations in order to remain strong. It's possible over the span of one person's lifetime to opt in to become a Jew, to become a radically different Jew one generation on, and then to no longer essentially be acting in ways that make you connected to the Jewish people by the end of a lifetime. That can actually also take place within the span of 4 years on a college campus. So that whole the idea of the massive transformational life cycle of multiple Jewish identities demands of us to rethink whether single empirical causes are useful at all in describing these changes, or whether we're simply operating in a radically different environment that requires of us to re-articulate what does it mean to be a Jew in this environment in which we take those changes for granted and put the burden on ourselves to re-articulate what we want Judaism to mean. The major problem, or one of the major problems that this creates, and I'm going to start making reference to the source sheets. Do you have them in front of you? Oh, bright green. Great. One of the core confrontations that this creates is with one of Judaism's classic ideas, a text that those of you who have been to the Institute before may have seen before, and that I actually wrote about in the opening letter in your binder, which nobody reads, so now I can make reference to. One of Judaism's classic idea about Jewish identity, which is that Jewish identity is what we might call permanent and sticky. The technical term for which I'm going to use is ontological, an identity that is only defined in reference to itself, an essential identity related to its own being, or a characteristic that can never be lost even if it changes. The Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin says as follows: Israel has sinned. So what happens when a Jew starts acting in the world, an Israelite, a Jew, starts acting in the world in ways that seem at odds with what they're supposed to be doing? And the rabbis say, Rabbi Abba Bar Azabda said, I'm in source 1, even though the person, the Israelite, has sinned, they are still called an Israelite. Afal pi shechata Yisraelhu. It's not just that the person is still called an Israelite who sins remains in the category of an Israelite. Right? And the rabbis go on to say, Rabbi Abba said, thus people say, a myrtle, though it stands among reeds, is still a myrtle, and it is so called. I don't know if anyone's ever actually done this, but it seems very similar to the rose by any other name, etc. So maybe Shakespeare was a little learned when it came to the Talmud. But the same idea is here. You can call yourself something else, but your identity is permanent and sticky. And no set of choices that you might make, theological, behavioral, or others, are going to actually be able to undermine your ability to hold on to that identity. as I'm going to try to unpack, I think, this idea, which is so critical to some understandings of Jewish identity. I think for probably many people in the room, you would identify in some respects with this. Your Jewishness is something that could never be scraped off of you. It's not a garment that you would discard. It's not something you would opt into sometimes and take off at other times. There's a permanent sticky quality to Jewish identity, which lives in such fundamental tension with the atmosphere of choice and the marketplace of identities, the dualities, the hybridities, the complexities that define what it means to be an American today, what defines what it means to be a diaspora Jew, but that seems so obvious and critical to the Talmud here. Now, it's possible for an identity like this to be permanent, sticky, ontological, or essential without being what we might call racist. It's possible for it to be something that doesn't have to devolve into ethnocentrism. As the scholar, Talmudic scholar Daniel Boyarin writes as follows: there are significant differences between Jewishness and the modern socio-political senses of race. The primary dissimilarities involve the fact that people can convert to Judaism, which would seem to suggest that it's merely a confession and that there are no racial characteristics that mark Jews off from other human groups. More revealingly, however, the convert's name is changed to Ben Avraham or Bas Avraham, son or daughter of Abraham. The convert is adopted into the family and assigned a new genealogical identity. But also, since Abraham is the first convert in the Jewish tradition, converts are his descendants in that sense as well. There is thus a sense in which the convert becomes the ideal type of Jew. He goes on to give other examples of the dichotomy or the difference between how an ontological, built-in sense of identity is fundamentally different than thinking about Jewishness as a race. And you can hear, although I don't think he attempts to do an apologetic here, you can hear, I want to be able to make a distinction between an ontological identity and an ethnocentric identity. I can still hold on to a sense that Jewishness is about some sense of deep, essential otherness, an intrinsic difference that I don't need to define, that's not about what I believe in, and it's not how I behave, and it's not about belonging to a synagogue. I don't have to be any of those things, and I still get to remain a Jew, but don't worry, it's not ethnocentrism. You can hear that taking place here. Nevertheless, even in spite of these protestations, there is a certain way, it seems to me, that this thins out in the American cultural atmosphere rather quickly. Absent anti-Semitism to reinforce an essential identity that doesn't require me to do anything or believe in anything, how do I hold on to the essentialism of that identity? What I ultimately do is I look for cultural indicators that signal that I'm still different and other, that depending on what age you are and whether you lived through these comic moments are either funny or extremely offensive. Sometimes maybe both. One example, a famous routine delivered by Lenny Bruce in the 1960s in New York comedy clubs, Jewish Goyish. By the show of hands, how many people have seen or heard this before? Great. Readers of the big book of Jewish humor, anyone? Bruce delivered this routine. I'll just read one short section of it, in which he was essentially doing call and response on categories of... Did I say something? Lenny Bruce? Frank Clark? Thank you. On the category...
Try this one.
Okay. Bruce delivers this routine in which he identifies certain things as being Jewish and Goyish, and as you'll see, quite obviously, and I know I'm going to explain funny things and make them not funny, and none of these are theological categories, behavioral categories, much less ethical categories, but famously, Kool-Aid is Goyish. I skipped Bnei B'rith is Goyish, Hadassah is Jewish, right? Kool-Aid is Goyish, all Drake's cakes are Goyish, pumpernickel is Jewish, and as you know, white bread is very Goyish. Instant potatoes, Goyish. Black cherry soda, very Jewish. Macaroons are very Jewish cake. Fruit salad is Jewish. Lime jello is Goyish. Lime soda is very Goyish. And I'm not going to read the rest of it. Some of it is a little off color. In the 1960s, the reason this is funny and why it's still funny to many of you is because you may have grown up with some of these things. Obviously, black cherry soda, not only Jewish, but Pesach dik. Not only do people oftentimes grow up with these categories, but it requires, in order to be funny, an assumption by both the Jews and the audience that there are things that they do that are different than non-Jews, but they can't fully articulate what they are. And it also requires an understanding by non-Jews and the audience that Jews are different and a little bit weird, but they can't be articulated in ways that would sound anti-Semitic. If he gets up and says, Jews have hook noses and control the banks, not okay. But that Jews eat pumpernickel bread, or that pumpernickel, not that they eat it, that the bread itself is Jewish, but white bread is Goyish, implies that the entire audience, Jewish and non-Jewish, understands that there is some difference between Jews and non-Jews, and it can't be expressed in ethical, theological, or behavioral terms, and instead has to be expressed in reference to cultural categories that still make sense to the cultural vocabulary of the time in which he's living. And I oftentimes find myself, I teach this to American Jewish college students, and not only do they not oftentimes recognize these categories, but they assume that this is extremely offensive. What do you mean we're pumpernickel and they're white bread? If you're making an argument to me, that all I can claim about what it means to be a Jew in America is some thin sort of cultural essentialism that does not actually sound that appealing, I'm out. So the very notion of Yisrael shechata, af al pi shechata Yisraelhu, a Jew retains some sort of essential ontological category of being that I can't demand a certain set of actions, but I can only describe in reference to a certain set of cultural categories, is simply not a tenable identity for most emerging American Jews in a cultural environment in which they can be accepted. The other text that I was thinking about, for those of you who are on Facebook, I assigned it as the pre-reading on Facebook in preparation for this lecture, is the famous scene in Annie Hall. Yes, you're with me? Go back and watch it if you haven't seen it in a while, where he's at Easter dinner, right, with Grammy Hall. I want to just give you a few of the key lines that take place in this moment in which Woody Allen's character not only is trying to participate in the discussion but completely can't, and ultimately turns to the camera to talk about these people, in which he's basically saying Goyish, but he doesn't say it. These people, he says, he says, I can't believe these people. They're talking about swap meets and boat basins, and Grandma over there is a classic Jew hater. And then you see the way he sees himself in their eyes, which is with the side locks and the beard and the black hat. That comes immediately after he says the phrase, "It's dynamite ham," right? Everybody says, "This is a great ham, Grammy Hall." He says, "Yeah, it's dynamite ham," which also is just it's like that's how a Jew would compliment a ham, right? There are other components to his ethnocentric identity in which he imagines himself as being other, but is never going to talk about it in ethics, behaviors, and theology, one of which is when she says, Anne tells us you've been seeing a psychiatrist for 15 years, right? That's a Jewish thing to do. And then ultimately you get the split screen between the quiet scene of Easter dinner in which they're eating the ham and the noisy, dark scene in which they're eating what looks like a holiday meal, in which his mother is yelling, "His wife has diabetes," which is the best line in the whole movie. And the two scenes ultimately begin a dialogue with each other, right? When Annie Hall's mother says, "What do you do for the holidays?" I should have just shown it. What do you do for the holidays? The answer is we fast to atone for our sins. Annie Hall's mother says, "What sins? I don't understand." And they say, "To tell you the truth, neither do we." Now, if we were going to try to argue that American Jewishness in this kind of, in this portrayal, American Jewishness is highly ontological. There's something different and other about what it means to be a Jew. Nothing is actually defining his own behavior as Jewish, except for a built-in assumption that the combination of how they see us and we see ourselves correlate to each other. We're different in somewhat inarticulable ways, and that nothing can actually be characterized as ethical, behavioral, or theological, and everything is basically the thin veneer of a kind of ethnic identity. Now, as I indicated, much of this is disappearing for reasons that I want to unpack, although I think for many modern Jews, even those who are skeptical that Annie Hall or Lenny Bruce represent the pinnacle of how American Jews should see themselves, one could argue, it does still remain a kind of seductive idea, a little bit under the surface for many Jews who would deny that they still believe in some sort of ontological notion of identity. So for instance, a lot of Jews are really fascinated by the idea of Jewish genetics, Jewish DNA. If you've ever been intrigued by that, you're still playing in some category in which Jewishness is somehow about an ethnic and genetic story, even after we can say over and over, reinforcing over and over again, that a convert and a Jew were both standing at Sinai. Those texts remind us that having some sort of Jewish DNA is not like a leg up. It's not an intrinsic category of what it means to be a Jew, but there is kind of a still longing for, a nostalgia for those categories of identity which are fixed firm and never can be taken away, or the obsession with the attraction to stories of Jews who hide their identity over long periods of time and ultimately are rediscovered, which are enchanting and magnificent stories, but what they convey under the surface is that we like the story of what it means to be a Jew in the purest sense of the word, despite the fact that you may have spent 50 or 60 years with a different mask of an identity which was hiding the true sense of what you were supposed to be. But the best version of articulating why this seems to be going away, this notion of ontological identity as something that it will not hold in the American Jewish story, is what we might call the half-Jew phenomenon. You know, a generation ago when someone would have said, "I'm only a half-Jew," the nice, if a little paternalistic response that a Jew would respond would be, "No, you're not. You're fully a Jew. Don't worry. The fact that you're calling yourself a half-Jew seems to imply that you think you're less of a Jew, and we're willing to have you entirely." But actually, more and more people are starting to identify as half-Jews, not because they have a sense of their own inferiority, but because they're looking for ways to reinforce the other half of who they are. It's not that I'm half-Jew because I think I'm less of a Jew. It's because I also want to honor my Italian Catholic heritage. I'm half Jewish and half Catholic. I'm half Jewish and I'm half Italian. And that move is one of the ways in which a community that says in response to somebody who says, "I'm half Jewish, you're fully Jewish," is a community that's thinking in terms of ontological identity to a population that's not. We'll come back to this a little bit shortly. What I want to do now is I want to do three things, which we'll do in the course of the source book. The first is, I want to present three options for how I see American Jewry responding to the loss of the ontology narrative, the way in which American Jewish leaders and institutions tend to think about if ontology is no longer the category of identity, what do we do instead? What should we do instead? I then want to go back and think about what it should mean, take a step back, for a tradition that thinks about identity in these types of singular terms to confront a diasporic environment like America that privileges multiple identities, complexities, and hybridities. What does that encounter actually look like? I want to conclude with perhaps some way forward, maybe a little bit of a vision for American Jewish identity that acknowledges the uniqueness of this present moment and maybe gives us some language to how to think about it forward. So I want to suggest that American Jewry tends to respond in at least one of three ways. The first, and I'm going to skim very quickly over Herodotus and Evans Pritchard. One of the things that American Jewry does to respond to the loss of an ontological narrative of identity is to replace ontology with what we'll call thick description. I can't say that somebody is essentially a Jew, so I will describe Jewish identity by describing what it is that Jews do. This is an old human pastime that goes back to at least to Herodotus. We could also have used de Tocqueville, which is somebody comes from a different cultural environment and looks at a group of people and how they're acting and tries to come to some sort of conclusion about the meaning of those people's identity on the basis of their behaviors. Right? This is, in some ways, kind of old anthropology, right? The originating of anthropology. How can I can't say your identity means something, so I'll describe your identity in reference to your behaviors. This is a lot like the survey business in American Jewish life, in which we're going to describe identity in reference to either what Jews believe about the world, describe identity in reference sometimes to categories like denominations. I'm not sure I can answer what is a Jew, but I can tell you which boxes Jews fit into and which they don't. And I can express something about their identity through some description of how they behave. This would be, if you want, I won't even read the Herodotus piece, but you hear a grasping and a searching through describing what people do as a vehicle to try to come up with some cultural argument of who they are. But the reason I brought this piece from Evans Pritchard here, which I think is so significant, is that around the early 1960s, the anthropological community, Evans Pritchard is one of the great examples of it, starts to recognize a basic flaw in this methodology of trying to describe identity, which is that there's virtually no way for the anthropologist to describe something without reference to pre-existing set of categories and understanding about how the world is supposed to operate. So we always make the natives, right, into acting in religious categories that we recognize from our home church. The fatal flaw, basically, of this type of anthropological research is that we are fixing categories on the basis of our own identities. I wonder sometimes whether the attempt to describe the activity of North American Jewry is fundamentally flawed, precisely because those who are doing the describing, and this is not meant in any sort of personal attack, those who are doing the describing are operating with a set of thick categories about what identities they should be looking for, what behaviors and categories they want to see, and therefore expressing either surprise, disappointment, or whatever about the ways that people are actually acting. So even if one of our attempts was to say, ontology doesn't work, but maybe thick description can get us there, are we ultimately setting up some sort of methodology or activity that's going to be fundamentally flawed? A favorite example of this is a great piece of Torah I learned once about nature films, right? You know that nature film? You've seen it, in which you see the antelopes running through the plains or the steppes or whatever part of the world, and it's magnificent. And you say in the back of your head, how fortunate are we to watch this incredible display of nature? Until you realize that the reason that the antelopes are running is because there's a helicopter filming them. So actually the act of witnessing something and trying to describe it is actually caused and catalyzed and influenced by the very describing itself. So one of the risks in the work of trying to describe somebody's identity on the basis of thick description is how much are we doing a thick description and how much are we imposing categories to ultimately do that. When we're doing the work of description, can you ever actually keep up with the pace of change? And so much of American Jewish identity is so profoundly idiosyncratic that there oftentimes seems to be this huge divide between who American Jews are and the relevance of the categories in which they're put. A second response that I think American Jews attempt, and we'll skip over here to source number 7, which is similar, is the position taken by basically Mordechai Kaplan, as expressed here in a book by Neil Gilman, which says, let's abandon this ontological notion of Jewishness and replace it with a different idea of Jewishness, which is to say that Jewish identity is contingent. You have to do one of 3 things in order to express your Jewish identity. Famously, he writes as follows, Kaplan used to teach that there are 3 possible ways of identifying with a religious community: by behaving, by believing, and by belonging. For Kaplan, this was essentially about belonging, right? And he goes on to describe it as follows, but let's just stay with that one phrase. How do I describe someone's identity? Because either through the way they behave, the way they believe, what they believe in, or to what they belong. This approach to understanding Jewish identity is basically like kicking the issue down the curb. Because what I'm basically saying, therefore, is I can't tell you what is a Jew, but if you tell me what it means, what a Jew believes, I'll evaluate whether this person fits into that category. That's why I call it a contingent way of answering the question of what is a Jew. Because when I answer the question of what is a Jew with a different question, which is what does a Jew believe? Or what does Jewish belonging look like? Or what are Jewish behaviors? And so I take the pressure off of myself to actually answer the question of what is a Jew by actually asking what does it mean to believe, behave, and belong? Now, not only is this problematic from a methodological standpoint, because I still now haven't answered that question. I've pushed it onto something else. But what happens when Jews still want to live as Jews in America without believing, without behaving, without belonging, but still with complex and hybrid identities which resist the kind of tyrannical ontological notion of being a Jew? Is that person still a Jew if they don't fit into any of these categories? The third effort that Jews try to do, or American Jews try to do, to articulate an understanding of what is American Jewish identity without the ontological category is through a framework of counterculture. That might be another effort that says Jewishness is basically about counterculture. I know at least one of my colleagues is speaking about counterculture and behavior tonight, so hopefully this will pick up. And I know throughout this week, some of the themes that I'm raising will be raised by my other colleagues on the faculty as well. But I might say, don't tell me what it is to believe, behave, and belong. Tell me what the dominant culture is, and I'll do something different. And in the doing of something different, I will assert my Jewishness. Most famous text that I think express this is Leviticus Rabbah 32:5. Rav Huna said in the name of Bar Kapara, because of four things, I'm on source 6, Leviticus Rabbah. Because of four things were the Israelites redeemed from Egypt. Because they did not change their names, and they did not change their language, and they did not speak ill of each other, and because none of them was sexually promiscuous. Let's break these four things down. Right? They don't change their names. They don't change their language, maybe their clothing. There's a debate on whether it's language or clothing. They don't speak ill of each other, and none of them was sexually promiscuous. The framing of the text is to respond to what seems to be a highly diasporic question that underlying the problem that the rabbi is trying to solve. And the diasporic question that it's asking is, how is it possible for God to descend from on high and extract one population from amidst another population? Both, how would God know who those people are, right? What are the indicators of their difference? And what are the things that those people did in the context of a highly assimilative environment to assert that they were different? How did they preserve their identity over time such that they could be extracted? And ultimately, the position that's taken here by Bar Kapara, you can divide into two. Two of the positions are counterculture of behavior. That's language and names. And two of them are counterculture of ethics, right? Not speaking ill of other people behind their back and what they do in the privacy of their own bedrooms. Now, paradoxically, the ethics are in secret, and the non-ethical behavioral stuff is in public. The other paradox is that throughout diaspora Jewish history, and this is Gerson Cohen's famous position in a speech he gave in the 1960s, the former chancellor of the seminary, called The Blessing of Assimilation in Jewish History, is that he says, actually, the first thing that Jews do when they get into diaspora is change their names and change their language and change their clothing. So the assumption that counterculture is the way in which I preserve what it means to be a Jew is not only countermanded by the fact that Jews simply don't do that, but it demands oftentimes of individuals to do precisely those choices to preserve their own identity that they are least likely to want to do. You think about the Irving, Max, and Rose phenomenon. Why are so many Jews, older Jews, named Irving, Max, and Rose? Those aren't Jewish names. But Jews come to America and look for non-Jewish names. And therefore, instead of naming their children Isaac, they name them Irving. And then non-Jews see all the Jews naming kids Irving and stop naming kids Irving. So those become Jewish names, right? They become Jewish names, but only after the consequence of an attempt to actually blend into the surrounding environment. Needless to say, there are American Jews who believe that the way in which to preserve their own identity is through behaving as a counterculture. And that includes ultra-Orthodox Jews, in some cases modern Orthodox and other conservative Jews who might actually wear their Jewishness in public. That's an effort to signal some sort of counterculture. There are other Jews who would say the way in which I preserve my countercultural identity is by acting ethically in ways that are different than the broader cultural environment. But overwhelmingly, the majority of American Jews are looking at a text like Bar Kapara the same way that Gerson Cohen looked at the text and said, "Are you kidding? Identity requires of me to be radically different than my cultural environment. And what if, and this is the big what if question for American Jews, what if in America we found ourselves in a cultural environment that's profoundly reinforcing to the very values that we care about as part of our tradition? Must I choose to be a counterculture to a cultural environment that's actually sympathetic to Jewishness? I get being a counterculture if I'm in the Pale of Settlement. I get that. Not only am I being reminded by others that I'm different, but I'm living in a cultural framework in which I simply don't identify and ascribe to the values that are surrounding me. But what if I actually belong to a cultural environment in which the ethics that I believe in actually correlate to the public ethics of the society? Must I choose different ethics and behaviors in order to retain my identity? Or is that in and of itself a shortcut to the departure of most of our people who will say that is simply an implausible claim for what Jewish identity is supposed to be? Let me take a step back now and ask then, all of these represent what I would say are three techniques by which the Jewish identity discourse in America is negotiated and navigated. Either dislocating the question of identity to some other category, what does it mean to believe, behave, or belong, or to replace identity with description, what do Jews do instead of who Jews are? Or by doing this move of insisting that Jewish identity is fundamentally a counterculture. Well, I want to take a step back and ask, how does a tradition that thinks of itself in ontological or essential terms confront diaspora, which is the question I've been asking all along? What I've done so far is, I think, map out what the problem is and how American Jews traditionally respond, and now I want to take a step back further. What does it mean to really confront diaspora? And by diaspora, I don't mean exile. I don't mean living in a cultural environment against your will, where your dominant narrative is about returning home, and where you assume that the place that you're in is not the place that you're supposed to be. Diaspora tells a different story, which imagines that I might have gone to a place outside the land of Israel, hard to believe, on my own volition, and in the pursuit of identity, as opposed to on the assumption of the demise of my identity. What happens in this cultural encounter? And here, as I've suggested all along, one of the gifts or one of the essential features of the diasporic experience is its multiplicity, is its options for hybridity, is the options for complex identities that enable us to believe and belong in all of these places. Leon Wieseltier has a tremendous article from the early 90s called, he kind of gives it away, Against Identity, in which he says as follows, "I hear it said of somebody that he is leading a double life. I think to myself, just two?" He goes on to say, "Diversity means complexity, identity means simplicity. Anyone who takes diversity seriously will see that identity is an illusion." He goes on to say, "There is greater truth in the plural. There is also a greater likelihood of decency. The multicultural individual is a figure of moral friction," which to Wieseltier is a compliment. "In such an individual, the mocker, the hater, and the killer may hit a bump." When we insist on the tyrannical notion of identity in a framework like America, in which multiple identities are possible, in which we know the ways that our tradition is enriched by complex narratives, by complex identities, sexual identities, political identities, and so forth, the insistence on one version of an identity sounds like an explicit political statement, which it often is. If you prefer, instead of Wieseltier, Edward Said. Anyone prefer Said? Actually very useful in this context. If you look at the top of page on source number 8, Said locates this as a particular phenomenon in the American experience in saying, American identity is too varied to be a unitary and homogeneous thing. Indeed, the battle within it is between advocates of a unitary identity and those who see the whole as a complex but not reductively unified one. This opposition implies two different perspectives, two historiographies, one linear and one subsuming, the other contrapuntal and often nomadic. Diaspora is one context, and America is an especially added layer, in which two postures begin to emerge about what it means to define and to describe one's identity. One that insists on a kind of unitary, homogeneous, and linear discourse, which is what Wieseltier is railing about, and the other that recognizes the contrapuntal, nomadic quality of living within a framework in which identity can be navigated with a whole variety of choices. We know that we as American Jews, us, our children, our grandchildren, are much more drawn in to the searching narratives of identity in the American context than those that think of themselves as unitary and singular. Narratives such as America has a very concrete, particular identity that has been lost because of things like multiculturalism represent this kind of paradoxically, they are their own American response to the American problem. They situate themselves in a cultural context of complexity and hybridity and insist on a singularity of choices. They insist, right, that there is something ontological about their own identity that requires no other point of reference and no other definition. And in contrast, what he describes as the historiography that is contrapuntal and nomadic is the same as Wieseltier's multiplicity of identities, diversity, actually creates a different ethical consciousness because it requires of you, it forces of you to challenge the particular choices of your identity that might be located within. In the rabbinic sources, I'm going to skip sources 9 and 10 for now. In the rabbinic sources, I locate these as two Jewish choices that are made in diaspora. Two stories told about rabbis who are both inhabiting diasporic conditions that, if not identical to the ones we live in, are familiar. What it means to be a rabbi living in Rome, opting into an identity and trying to figure out whether my identity is one that I completely take for granted or that I assume, not I take it for granted, I assume is unitary and homogeneous, or an identity that I allow to actually be in dialogue with the multiplicity and complexity of the cultural environment in which I'm in. The first is as follows, from Avot to Rabbi Natan. This is a great series of rabbinic texts that one after the other describes how great the rabbis are who they're talking about for their ability to withstand temptation. And Rabbi Akiva is pretty good. He's like 3rd out of 4. Don't marvel at Rabbi Tzadok, for Rabbi Akiva was even better than him. When he, that is Rabbi Akiva, went to Rome, he was slandered in front of a certain hegemon, that is a Roman ruler, who procured for him 2 comely women. He, this is the ruler, bathed them, anointed them, and adorned them like brides. And they fell all over him, Rabbi Akiva, all night, one saying, "Come to me," and the other saying, "Come to me." And he was sitting between them and spitting and would not turn to them. At dawn they went and beseeched the hegemon, the ruler, and said to them, "Death is preferable than you giving us to this man." Right? He withstands their sexual temptations the entire night. Consider what the cultural context that's imagined by this text is, that the environment of being able to live within this cultural context is entirely one of temptation, that the Jew is an opposite other who is tempted by this cultural environment but fundamentally doesn't belong, and that the posture that a Jew takes in this environment is to resist. His identity is fixed, and his job is to resist this cultural environment. The king sends and calls for Rabbi Akiva, and he said to him, "Why did you not conduct yourself with these women the way men conduct themselves with women?" Did I do something wrong? Right? What's wrong here? And this is even more powerful. Are they not comely? Are they not humans like you? Did not the one who created you create them? It's actually a stunning move by the rabbis, right? Are they not created in the image of God just like you? Do you think, right, you think that your position that you're taking is one that exclusively is dominant of Jewish values, but in fact, you're treating them not as human beings. And how does Rabbi Akiva answer? He answers in a way that reflects one posture that envisions what Jewish identity is supposed to be in diaspora, in which he says, "What shall I do? Their smell came over me as the scent of corpses and carrion and vermin." I wasn't not tempted because I was trying not to be tempted. I knew of myself as fundamentally different than them, and they weren't me. Put differently, you're saying these people are also created in the image of God. On paper, I agree with you. In practice, they're fundamentally different human beings. This is one deliberate posture of Jewish identity that's often assumed as the natural consequence or a choice that Jews make in the context of diaspora, in which they preserve and reinforce a sense of ontological otherness, not just ontological otherness of I have a different religion than you, but I'm almost a different species than you. The issue is not that I'm tempted to be part of the prevailing culture, but that I work extremely hard at preventing the possibility at even being part of this culture altogether. And in contrast, Rabbi Eliezer in the Rabbinic Midrash on Leviticus says as follows, in an explanation of a text from Leviticus which says, "You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy, and have set you apart from other people to be mine." And later on in the same chapter, describes the difference between Jews and others in reference to the same terminology of the difference between kosher animals and non-kosher animals. So you'd think it would be a setup for the same position that Rabbi Akiva took before. But in fact, Rabbi Eliezer reflects a very different posture, a different attitude about what it means to be a Jew living in diaspora. He says, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, "From where do we know that a person should not say, 'I have no desire to wear clothes made of wool of linen. I have no desire to eat the meat of pigs. I have no desire to commit adultery'? Rather, a person should say, 'I do desire these things, but what shall I do? My Father in heaven forbids it.'" See the difference here between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Akiva? I'm not supposed to work hard to prevent having a desire for a bacon cheeseburger. I'm supposed to acknowledge that the cultural environment of diaspora makes a whole variety of choices possible, and that as a human being, those are the choices that I would be inclined to make. But I have to locate for myself a different sort of posture which acknowledges the complexity of identity, acknowledges the hybridities that are made possible by multiple choices, and still elects to affirm a particular identity because that's what it means to be part of this community and culture. These reflect two radically different positions. I want to try for the last piece, and to the extent that I'm not putting all the pieces together, it is what it is. I want us to try for the last piece to see whether we can try to live at this threshold with re-asking this question, given the choices of who American Jews can be in the cultural environment of America and diaspora, what it means to inhabit this threshold. What would be the core set of values that American Jews could use to define what it means to be an American Jew in these environments? Or to go even a little further, it seems in some ways American Jews are still trying to be somewhat ontological. 95% of respondents to the Pew study say they are proud of being Jewish. That's an amazing statistic. They don't want to be told necessarily that in order to be a Jew, I have to believe, behave, and belong. Thank you, paying attention, that's good. You don't have to, according to these studies, believe, behave, or belong to anything. So in some ways, American Jews are still grasping at some essential notion of being Jewish, but it seems pretty clear that none of those essentialisms can translate into ethnocentrism if they're actually going to have any robust quality to be able to sustain themselves, much less perpetuate themselves over time. I want to suggest, therefore, an approach towards a new American Jewish identity which thinks of itself primarily as motivated by a commitment to a certain type of self-confidence. I say self-confidence knowing that it's an extremely weak word. What, an American Jew is exclusively defined by a sense of self-confidence? What do I have to do now? What's the rest of it? I'm still thinking about that. But I want us to ask whether maybe the privileged value that we want to locate as the critical feature of what it means to have some sense of I know I'm a Jew, and I don't want to attach that Jewishness to the believing, behaving, belonging, but I want to give some vehicle for American Jews to be able to withstand themselves a significant identity in a cultural environment in which they want to be, a cultural environment they're not trying to reject, might be through a posture of self-confidence. Let me read a couple of texts that try to make this case. Mishnah Avodah Zarah, one of my favorite texts in all of rabbinic literature. Prok, which is source 13. You have it? Source 13? Proclus, the son of a philosopher, asked Rabban Gamliel in Akko when the latter was bathing in the bathhouse of Aphrodite. See, sometimes the rabbis are wonderful because they do all the work of the text and the opening sentence. The dichotomy that's set up is magnificent. Non-Jew, or at least threatening to the Jewish identity, which is a Greek guy with a Greek-sounding name who has a very Greek job, right? Proclus, son of a philosopher, confronts a rabbi with a Jewish-sounding name and a Jewish job in a pagan city in the land of Israel. See the games that they're playing here? Akko as a pagan city in the land of Israel. I don't want to make it exclusively in a Jewish environment. I want to acknowledge it's in a hybrid cultural environment. Asks him a question when he, the rabbi, is bathing in the bathhouse of Aphrodite, which I think is meant to catalyze shock in the reader. What's the rabbi? You don't have to read off next, and I can say, what's the question, guys? What's the rabbi doing in the bathhouse of Aphrodite? He said to him, the Greek to the rabbi, "It is said in your Torah, written in your Torah, let nothing that has been forbidden stick to your hand." Right? You people are supposed to keep your distance for things that constitute idolatry. It can't stick to your hand. Much less are you supposed to enter into its cultural environments and participate in them. Why are you bathing in the bathhouse of Aphrodite? Now, what's beautiful about this as well is one of the things that makes America remarkable is not just that Jews fit into the cultural environment of America, but that Jewishness has become a part of American discourse. Right? So here, similarly, the way this text is articulated, the rabbi is being asked a question by a Greek speaker in this environment who knows to quote scripture back to the Jew. This is part of what it means to be a Jew in America. You can't get away with just inventing your own Jewishness because the non-Jews know Jewishness. There's a social and cultural commodity to Jewishness, which is part of the public culture in the public square, which means that Jews are defending their own choices, not just in the framework of their own communities, but in public in reference to other individuals who may know more about what it means to be Jewish. And he replies to him saying as follows, "We do not answer questions relating to Torah in a bathhouse." First of all, I think that is actually the intended reaction. I think it's supposed to be funny. But his first answer is, you think you're quoting Torah to me? The first rule of Torah is you don't do Torah in the bathroom. So you don't really know as much as you think you know. When he came out, he's also saying to him, your question is not as serious as you think it is, and therefore I'm going to finish what I'm doing here in the bathhouse, and then I will come out. When he came out, he said to him, I did not come into her domain, she has come into mine. People do not say the bath was made as an adornment for Aphrodite, rather they say Aphrodite was made as an adornment for the bath. This is an incredible interpretive gesture, and here I have a debt to Professor Seth Schwartz, who wrote a beautiful article on this piece called Gamliel and Aphrodite's Bath. An incredible move being made by Rabban Gamliel here to say, the cultural environment in which we live is neutral, and I have as significant a claim of my identity in this cultural environment as you do. The fact that you slapped your iconography of a competing value system on a neutral cultural environment is your choice. Or we might say in Jewish, that's your goyim nachas. That's what you did to the bathhouse. But the bathhouse is not Jewish, right? It's a bathhouse. And the fact that you came along and attached your meaning and value system to this place is your choice. But I get to be who exactly I want to be. I get to live in this cultural environment, acting as a rabbi and participating in the public culture without having to make some sort of perverse set of countercultural choices of rejecting the bathhouse because it happens to have a statue of Aphrodite. It's actually quite similar to a move that American Jews, I think, made unconsciously when we patronized Catholic hospitals. What was the logic of Catholic hospitals? For Catholics, healing is a theology. It's a core feature of Catholic theology to build hospitals as healers. And what did Jews do? They said, it's a hospital. The fact that you stuck a cross on the wall doesn't mean that I'm actually participating in your theological paradigm. I get to own this environment as much as you do. Idea number one here is that America offers an opportunity for Jews to think of their own identities as not so locked into the anxiety of the extent to which we participate in a cultural environment as a loss of our own identities, but actually asking the question back to ourselves, who do you want to be in that cultural environment? Instead of the assumption that the cultural environment is intrinsically, like Proklos thinks, intrinsically undermining what it means to be an American Jew, the first question is, who do you want to be? And once you decide who you want to be, you be a Jew out in public, independent of the cultural circumstances that others might think are mitigating your own identity. One of the best exemplars to this effect, believe it or not, is Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the 7th Lubavitcher Rebbe, in a letter to the Jewish community of Teaneck, New Jersey from 1982. The amazing little piece of American Jewish history where a sequence of, it was a correspondence originally between the Lubavitcher Rebbe and the head of the Reform movement, Rabbi Joseph Glazer, in which Glazer had asked the Lubavitcher Rebbe to not put menorahs in public parks in America. Right? Why? Because from the perspective of the Reform movement, the position of American Jews was fundamentally tenuous. It's ironic. It's fundamentally tenuous. And the job of Jews, because of our historical memory of having been persecuted in cultural environments in which Christianity was a dominant discourse, our job in America was supposed to be preserving the neutrality of the cultural environments in which we were in. And Glazer says to Lubavitcher Rebbe, you're making the position of Jews vulnerable because when you put a Hanukkah menorah in a public park, it gives permission to them to put a creche in the public park. And he doesn't say this, but he's like, and we can hear the horses of the Cossacks coming. When you put those things in a cultural in the public environment, you actually invite the actual physical demise of the Jewish people. Menachem Mendel Schneerson's position is unbelievably patriotic. He says the Jewish community in the USA is as old as the USA itself. We know the problems it faced and the actual discriminations it suffered until it has won its place in this country. Yet even in this day of age, prejudice and anti-Semitism exist, not only latently but overtly. We must not relax our alertness. He acknowledges the historical problems, the difference between what it would have been at one time in history to try to do this and not. But he says, skip down to the second to last paragraph now to come to the essential point. Schneerson says, and I'll wrap up in just a moment for some questions. Now to come to the essential point. Why is it so important for Jews to have a Hanukkah menorah displayed publicly? The answer is that experience has shown that the Hanukkah menorah displayed publicly during the 8 days of Hanukkah has been an inspiration to many, many Jews and invoked to them a spirit of identity with their Jewish people and the Jewish way of life. To many others, it has brought a sense of pride in their Yiddishkeit and the realization that there is no reason really in this free country to hide one's Jewishness, as if it were contrary or inimical to American life and culture. On the contrary, it is fully keeping with the American national slogan, E pluribus unum, and the fact that American culture has been enriched by thriving ethnic cultures which contributed very much, each in its own way, to American life, both materially and spiritually. Skip a paragraph. In summary, Jews, either individually or communally, should not create the impression that they are ashamed to show their Jewishness or that they wish to gain their neighbor's respect by covering up their Jewishness. It's actually stunning, right? Nor will this attitude ensure their rights to which they are entitled, including the privilege of publicly lighting a Hanukkah menorah, a practice which has been sanctioned by precedent and custom as to become a tradition. Schneerson's argument is, when are we going to wake up and realize that America provides an opportunity for a Jewish self-confidence in public? That we think that by actually suppressing our identities in public, we're saving ourselves. But in fact, displaying our identities in public is a gift that has been made possible by the American experience. The irony of the Rebbe saying to the head of the Reform movement in the 70s, you're not being American enough, right? You're missing out on the opportunity that America provides, signals an attitude shift, a posture that I want to suggest is one of the tools that could be useful for answering the question of what is an American Jew, which is that one American Jew is a Jew who is in some ways confident about their Jewishness in an American cultural and political context. Finally, I think the architect of this idea of American Jewish confidence is actually Franz Rosenzweig. Rosenzweig writes this actually in the early 20s. Rosenzweig's project as a thinker is interrupted by two tragedies, both the fact that he was doing this project in Germany in the 1920s and also by his own by getting ALS and dying quite young of this debilitating illness. But Rosenzweig had already identified in the 20s that all solutions to Jewish identity that thought of themselves as contingent and based in adjectives, all of those solutions were fundamentally weak. They displaced a real question of what is a Jew with answers that were provisional. He says Zionism is a caricature of Jewish identity. He says, I'll start from the second paragraph. What holds us or has held us together since the dawn of emancipation? In what does the community of our contemporary life show itself, that community which alone can lead from the past to a living future? The answer is frightening. Since the beginning of emancipation, only one thing has unified the German Jews in a so-called Jewish life: emancipation itself, the Jewish struggle for equal rights. Paradoxically, in order to become, we've been so committed to the project of becoming equal that once we developed political programs that we realized we weren't sure who we'd actually become. Once you actually acquire political power, and here he's so much more right about the state of Israel and the American Jewish experience than he even was when he wrote this. Once American Jews figured out how they can actually be Americans, they were prompted with the question of what it means to be actually a Jew. And the following page as follows. He answers by saying, the only way to ultimately become a Jew is through the phrase that he calls a Jewish human being. We have to be willing to stand up with the full integrity of being human beings in the cultural and political context in which we're operating, and to drive that vision of what it means to be a human being driven through Jewish values and ideas. I'll read the bottom three paragraphs. Start from the middle of that paragraph. It is necessary for him to free himself from those stupid claims that would impose Judaism on him as a canon of definite circumscribed Jewish duties, vulgar orthodoxy, or Jewish tasks, vulgar Zionism, or God forbid, Jewish ideas, vulgar liberalism. If he has prepared himself quite simply to have everything that happens to him, inwardly and outwardly, happen to him in a Jewish way, his vocation, his nationality, his marriage, and even if that has to be his Judaism, then he may be certain that with the simple assumption of that infinite pledge, he will become in reality wholly Jewish. And there is no indeed other way to become completely Jewish. The Jewish human being arises in no other way. All recipes, whether Zionist, Orthodox, or liberal, produce caricatures of men that become more ridiculous the more closely the recipes are followed. There's one recipe alone that can make a person Jewish, and hence, because he is a Jew and destined to a Jewish life, a full human being, that recipe is to have no recipe. As I have just tried to show, and I feel rather inadequate words, agreed. Our fathers had a beautiful word for it that says everything: confidence. Rosenzweig is trying to animate in a Jewish sensibility that any attempts to answer what it means to be a Jew with adjectives, what it means to be a Jew is to be this kind of Jew, to believe, to behave, to belong, all of those efforts mislead the fundamental challenge that American Jews have, which is to be American human beings, and to use the vehicles of Jewish tradition to animate a certain self-confidence of standing up straight in that environment. Now, do I know what that looks like and consists of? No. Do I have a week with you here for us to think about it? Possibly. What I'm trying to take with us over the course of today, what I tried to present, is that we are operating in a framework in which the pre-existing assumptions of identity are no longer valid. The short-term solutions of thick description, contingent identity, or others fall short in terms of the spiritual satisfaction they provide us in answering the question of what it means to be a Jew, and that it might require require us simply, not a simple prescription, as Rosenzweig tries to say, but a posture, an approach that acknowledges the riches that diaspora and America provide to us and challenge us to stand up straight in that cultural context. Thank you. We have some time for some questions, comments, responses. Yes, the back. Do we have a mic, or you're just going to go for it, and then I'll try to repeat it.
What is the role of the Jewish community?
The question is, what is the role of the Jewish community, according to Franz Rosenzweig? That's a good question. I don't know if I know the answer completely. I'm sure some of my colleagues will know better. Specifically, find Leon Wiener-Dow, and he'll be able to answer it better. I do think Rosenzweig, as far as I understand it, was not that interested in Jewish community as was traditionally composed. And in that respect, actually has kind of interesting comparison to asking this question today, which assumes that you don't answer the question of what it means to be a Jew by looking at what a community is. You answer the question of what it means to be a Jew by answering what a Jew is supposed to be. And then you use that as a framework to ultimately build community around it.
Building on the question we just heard, where's the point of intersection between this discussion and the institutions of Judaism that kind of form the basis of the American Jewish community?
That's a great question. Look, one of the reasons you all are here is that you often, many of you, participate in Jewish institutional life in North America. Not all of you, but many of you do. And one of the missions of this institution is to convene serious conversation around such topics with the folks who actually have the capacity to be change agents in those types of environments. So I want to answer this, I guess, your question in a couple of ways. One would be, what would happen when the institutions of Jewish life in North America, the ones that have not caught up to this conversation, what happens when they take seriously that the shortcuts to Jewish identity that their own institutional identity is built on are no longer viable? Right? What does it mean for us to be skeptical of those approaches when, if there are institutions of Jewish life in North America that are built on the premise that Jews are other because of anti-Semitism? There are institutions of Jewish life in North America that are built on the premise that Jews are Jews because Jews are supposed to belong and be members of communities, and if they're not Jews. What I guess I'm asking, I'm in essence flipping the question back. What would really happen if Jewish life in America confronted this question unimpeded by the almost unnatural blockages that institutional life necessarily puts up to being able to confront new realities? I want to say that more generously. When a community builds its institutions, it does so to respond to particular challenges at particular moments. One of the tragic things that a community can do is to believe, therefore, that what it believes in is a sum total of the institutions that it built. We do this in the American Jewish community all the time. We think that Jewishness is equivalent to those institutions. Part of the risk with that is that you will oftentimes do things to perpetuate institutions that are not actually in your long-term interest in terms of perpetuating identities. And those are genuine, serious challenges because you got to keep the buildings open and you got to keep people employed. And we're sitting, I think, exactly at that intersection of a recognition of what if Jewish identity means something radically different than the Jewish institutions that we built prepared us to be able to handle. I have many more opinions on this, but I'm going to pause right there. Yes, Mr. Mike.
I'm Peter Sussman from Newton, Massachusetts. And I'd like you to comment, if possible, on the emergence of the so-called alt-right in the United States, most recently evinced by the idea of putting parentheses on both sides of a Jewish name. And this finally emerged in vicious anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish journalists that had made anti-Trump statements. And then some other journalists on their own, of their own volition, started putting parentheses on either side of their names.
The question relates to the rise of the alt-right in America, the emergence of this actually really profound anti-Semitism, especially on Twitter. Twitter is like probably the biggest hotbed of anti-Semitism in the world. And and especially the brackets phenomenon of putting brackets around the names of Jews, and in response, a number of Jews putting brackets around their own names to self-identify as Jews. So first of all, what I tried, the needle I tried to thread is that I want to talk about Jewish identity without the shortcut of Jewish identity as established by anti-Semitism, while not pretending that anti-Semitism has disappeared. Simply asking, can we actually differentiate these conversations? The reason I'm doing that is because, as many of us know, when it comes to both, when we talk about America and we talk about Israel, when we make the exclusive provenance of the conversation simply the issue of anti-Semitism, we strip ourselves both of moral agency to think about our own responsibility, and we strip ourselves of the challenge to ask the much harder questions about our own identity that are prompted when we have to answer it for ourselves than when others get to answer it for us. So I say, yes, there is still significant, mostly subterranean anti-Semitism in America. What I think is different about the American experience is that there is still yet to be, my theory is that it won't happen, but there's still yet to be, I'm not a prophet and I don't want to try to be one, there is yet to be state-sponsored anti-Semitism, and that constitutes an essential, almost existential difference to almost any other diaspora that Jews have ever lived in. Whereas there's no chance in the world that Jews will ever outlive the phenomenon of anti-Semitism. And it's like one of those idea bubbles that just lives in my head of maybe there is something essential about the Jewish character that will never withstand this otherness. But I'm asking myself, if I make that the totality of how I think about Jewish identity, we're not only shortchanging our own moral responsibilities to think about identity. A, that's that. B, we might be wrong about America. And C, it's not that interesting, right? It exonerates us of thinking about what we're supposed to do with Jewish identity. Because I would also suggest that even Jews in America who are fixated on being ontologically other because of the narrative of anti-Semitism are watching that it's no guarantee for their children or grandchildren to opt into their own Jewishness. So even if we think that that's right, it's a very poor gamble on which we might be able to pin our Jewish identity hopes. One other text to think about, because I can't stop thinking about it when it comes to these issues in Jewish identity. If you haven't watched the television show Transparent, you must. I think it's the most significant Jewish television show that's ever been produced. And it has incredible ramifications for some of the questions that we're navigating here tonight and over the course of these couple of weeks, in which the whole premise of the show is the complexity and hybridity of identity. In the second season, I'm not giving too much away, the show winds up hovering around this question of epigenetics. Is it possible for historical events to transform the way in which genes respond in particular moments, which is a kind of a radical piece of genetic theory? If I'm not misrepresenting it, you'll tell me over dinner. And in the premise of this show, the suggestion of the producers is that there are two epigenetic consequences for this family, one with respect to queerness and one with respect to Jewishness. That there is something that continues to be an ontological feature of identity that gets passed forward over time with respect to being queer and other and Jewish and other. And the show is doing that at the same time as is the most radical show in terms of expressing the individual and autonomous ways in which people make their own choices. So my answer to you is, how do we hold those at the same time? Right? The possibility that there is some sort of anti-Semitic ontological otherness and the requirement that we have to think about defining identity in terms that are not entirely held hostage by that narrative.
Hi, I'm Tony Sandler from Boca Raton, Florida. I wanted to dovetail off of the question over there about federation and the organizations that we're a part of. One of the things that Rosenzweig did speak about was that he did not believe that there could be real change for the Jewish community from within, that you had to go outside of the community to observe it and help change the community. Therefore, the Federation would not be necessarily the best organization to to make the best decisions on how to move forward, but you had to be other to help us move forward. That's what I understand it as.
Well, I want to detach it from federation specifically. I don't want to get into trouble. This is being filmed. And we do have good relationships with many federations around the country. But yes, I understand. So a couple of things. One is, I think you're right, that oftentimes the ability for any institution, any synagogue and otherwise, to self-transform without this sense of outsiderness is very, very difficult and very limited. I think there is an emerging there are emerging parallel institutional cultures in Jewish life, those that are perpetuating themselves on the basis of the way that they run and their insiders, and those that are simply trying to do Jewish in other environments outside of the framework of the institutions themselves. Hillel International, this is a major feature of Jewish life on campus today, has been the engagement phenomenon. And the engagement phenomenon says the fact that somebody doesn't enter into the traditional modes of Jewish life doesn't mean that they're not interested in being Jewish. This is a novel idea which is 100% right. Human beings are still pursuing meaning. Human beings who happen to be Jews are still pursuing meaning. Human beings who are still Jews are still pursuing community. Human beings who happen to be Jews are still pursuing purpose. They are not necessarily looking to pursue meaning, community, and purpose through institutions that insist that the precise cocktail of how meaning, community, and purpose is exercised in the context of a particular building. They don't want to accept that whole package. So how do we as a community respond and say, our responsibility is to create context for meaning, community, and purpose that don't simply require entering in to the full package of these commitments in order to do so? For the many Jews, denominational, communal, and otherwise, who like the packages that as have been currently constructed, great. The more the merrier. But the idea that that is the only way in which Jewish identity is going to be conveyed is through fixed, rigid structures is simply a totally untenable idea in the context of this environment. What it frees us to be able to then talk about as a Jewish community is what the diverse ways in which Jewish identity is going to express itself in public that are not measured by unnatural means of measurement. Right? And this is a very, very difficult thing because, again, our institutions are oftentimes driven by it. But if your goal is to engage Jews, you can't make the metric of engagement how many of them become members. If your goal is to engage Jews, you can't make the metric how many of them come into the building afterwards. It's a very, very difficult thing for institutions to do themselves because they're oftentimes driven by those kinds of metrics and objectives. But I think it's a very significant challenge as that's who American Jews become to think about what does it mean, for instance, to create much more significant investment in Jewish public culture. That's what Gamliel is. That's what the Schneerson is. No, I believe it. I'm not putting on you. I appreciate it. Thank you. No, that's not what this is about. I mean, our goal is not, there's none of that on either side. Our goal is to think about if this is the transformation of what identity is becoming, what's our role as leaders and as communities to sometimes adjust our institutional ability to navigate those changes and sometimes think about what it means to engage the people in Jewish life outside of the framework of those institutions.
Jack Berger from Chicago. Yeah. We're going through, certainly in America, what I call the amortization of America. In Chicago, if you drive down any commercial street or retail, you'll see that there are a lot of spaces going dark. Several years ago, there was a presentation here about paying for services. And there's a whole transition going on within the younger Jewish community. I know that when my parents came to the States, the first thing they did was they joined a synagogue. I joined a synagogue. Our kids don't feel it's important to join a synagogue. How do you change that dynamic, or how do you change the understanding of what it means to be part of a Jewish community?
It actually is really a great question. My very short and pithy answer, because I want to be able to take just a couple of more, is I really do not believe that young Jews do not want to be part of Jewish life. I believe that young Jews, on a balance, do not want to pay into the structures that have been created by the organized Jewish community, which are the delivery systems for what we have thought for a long time as the mechanism to lead a Jewish life. And as a result, we've created incredibly unnatural tensions around this, where even well-intentioned communal leaders who are trying to get people to their institutions can't ultimately let go that the way in which they evaluate the success of the way they engage others is by that bottom line. I see it in my own life, in my own community. I see it in, Sharon Brous is here somewhere. She'll be teaching some of you. The community that she created in Los Angeles defied a lot of the demographic expectations, as well as other religious and spiritual leaders in the American Jewish community who have done so. There is a culture, there is a growing, I know Moishi House, right? There are all sorts of institutions in the Jewish community that are actually providing for young Jews what they want, and where it's not surprising to see actually a return on investment that's not just immeasurable by identity terms, but also by philanthropic terms, by people belonging, participating, and paying. It's a very, very hard thing to do, to allow people to define identity on their own terms when we have thought that our job is to give our children their identities, right? Even when we say it out loud, you become aware of how ludicrous that is, right? People build identities. They don't have identities handed to them. And so the more that we insist that the way in which those identities are going to be expressed are through the same vehicles that our parents and grandparents express their identities, the more likely we are to be disappointed. Let me take, oh yeah, go ahead.
I think I didn't understand the fullness or missed something about your characterization of self-confidence as central to American identity. It seems like you either have to say self-confident of what, and that question is going to be something about identity, or that any of the various groups in our multicultural society can be termed Jews, the Poles, the Russians, the people who came over on the Mayflower, whatever.
So first of all, I mean, technically anybody can become a Jew in America, and I mean that not in a completely pithy way. In the New York Jewish Population Study, I believe 5% of people who self-identify as Jewish in that study had no Jewish parents and had not converted. Right? So what is that? It's a term that Stephen Cohen calls voluntary affiliational identity, which means I say that I'm a Jew and therefore I am. Now that most of the people who are counted in that number are people who are married to Jews, and so they now identify as being part of the Jewish community, by extension, part of the Jewish people, and they'll count themselves as Jews in the context of the survey. So we are already living in an environment in which the notion that Jewishness is a framework with rigid boundaries between the insiders and the outsiders doesn't exist anymore. Frankly, the state of Israel has contributed to that by creating a law of return based on a category of identity that doesn't correlate to Jewish law. If one of your grandparents is Jewish, you're eligible to be a citizen of Israel at the right of return as being counted as a member of the Jewish people. That creates all sorts of problems because you have a gap between the Ministry of Interior, for whom that's their rule, and the Ministry of Religion, which won't marry you, bury you, or do a bunch of other things if you don't count as a Jew. But what they're still doing is saying the categories, the boundaries of Jewish life are no longer defined and circumscribed by these types of legal categories. You want to be part of the Jewish people, you can. Partly what I think I'm putting on the table, and there's a longer conversation to be had apropos your first half of your question, what does that confidence look like? And we can keep talking about it. But part of it is like a mind shift for us as Jews in the Jewish community to start recognizing that whereas when you count Jews a certain way, our numbers seem to be diminishing, when you evaluate Jewishness as a brand in America, it's very solid. And the difference in communal life, in attitude, in identity, from thinking of Jewishness as an identity that people want to have, really alters your perspective on what it would mean to actually fortify that identity, both in the framework of private institutions and in public institutions. We'll take one last one.
I'm Joy Stiefel from Seattle, Washington, and I was thinking as I listened to you, and I'd never thought about it before, that the half-Jew today has more confidence as a Jew and as a non-Jew than in the past. But how the synagogues, etc., are having, except for the Reform movement, are having a huge difficulty dealing with the half-Jew and don't know how to deal with it. And also, in the context of the state of Israel, now there's all this negative publicity that an Orthodox rabbi's conversion is not being accepted. Where does that leave the half-Jew, the synagogues? I mean...
Yeah. I'm gonna sideline the chief rabbinic question on the premise of if you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. But on the American Jewish question, I actually think part of what I'm trying to get at is a half-Jew, the language of half-Jew would have represented a problem for a different generation of Jewish life. It threatens categories of Jewish identity for a community that still thinks in ontological terms. It is a framework of huge opportunity for a Jewish community that stops thinking in ontological terms and starts thinking in opportunistic and confidence-oriented terms. And the question becomes then not how do I classify somebody as a half-Jew, but what do I do in order to engage at least that half in making a serious commitment to Jewish life? And what do I have to be prepared for in terms of a set of other choices that we're going to have to deal with when a person also wants to hold on to the other half of their identity? And again, half-Jew is an opening for the Jewish people. Right? It reflects its own, as you're right, it reflects its own type of self-confidence of Jewishness in America, because I can hold on to my Jewishness at the same time as I hold on to another identity that in other times in Jewish history and other frameworks would have been thought to have been in competition with each other. And I want to flip that and ask, in what ways does that present an opportunity? Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Yehuda. It's dinner time now. The dinner tent is downstairs. Anybody who needs help with getting there, come see me or Sharon Laufer. And at 8 o'clock is our evening program in the courtyard. Let's try and keep on time. Thanks.